Hello, everyone, and welcome to the New York State Youth Justice Institute's Lunch and Learn webinar series. My name is Brian Rainey, and I am a research fellow at the YJI. On behalf of everyone at the YJI, I am happy to welcome each of you to this month's webinar session. Thank you for joining us in this virtual space and for taking the time to learn more about research on youth justice issues. Please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. Our gratitude also goes out to our partners in New York State, which are the Division of Criminal Justice Services, the Office of Children and Family Services, the University at Albany SUNY, and the New York State Juvenile Justice Advisory Group. I'd also like to give a special shout out to Dina Thompson, who is in our virtual audience today. Dina presented a lunch and learn on restorative practices and youth justice in February, and we learned so much from her. I also just want to say that I miss having the lunch and learn planning meetings with Dina because I always knew that I would be smiling throughout those meetings. So thanks for joining us again, Dina. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, the goals of this webinar series are to 1, act as a source for cutting edge research on juvenile justice issues, 2, to provide this information in an engaging and thought-provoking format, and 3, to bring together scholars and practitioners from various fields to explore these issues. It is our pleasure today to host Dr. Sean Marsh. Like everyone here, I am excited to see his presentation on trauma-responsive approaches. I will now pass the baton to Dr. Tori Kanoki, the YJI's research associate, to introduce Dr. Marsh. Tori, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Brian. So today I have the honor of introducing my mentor of many years, Dr. Sean Marsh. Shawn is the director of the Judicial Studies Graduate Degree Program and associate professor with appointments in Judicial Studies, Communication Studies, and Social Psychology at the University of Nevada, Reno. As the Director of Judicial Studies, he oversees the only program known to offer master's and PhD degrees in judicial studies exclusively for sitting judges. He also is the former Chief Program Officer for the juvenile law at the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, or NCJ-FCJ, where he taught and provided technical assistance on topics such as implicit bias and trauma-responsive justice, and oversaw a myriad of national projects focused on child welfare, juvenile justice, judicial decision-making, school engagement, and trauma and victimization. Shawn is a social psychologist with research and teaching interests in the areas of psychology and law, bias and decision-making, adolescent development, trauma, resiliency, crisis intervention, and juvenile justice. His background also includes working with youth in detention and correction settings as an educator and mental health clinician, and he's been licensed school counselor, professional counselor, and clinical professional counselor. In his current position at the university and prior position at the NCJ-FCJ, Shawn has served on numerous national advisory committees, including the U.S. National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention Task Force, and the U.S. Centers for Disease Control STRIVE, Youth Violence Prevention Council, the U.S. Office of Victims and Crime Coordinating Systems of Care Steering Committee, and the National Training Team for Racial and Ethnic Fairness in the Courts, coordinated by the National Center for State Courts. His scholarly work appears in various edited books and journals, including Youth Violence and Juvenile Justice, Juvenile and Family Law Court Journal, Correctional Psychiatry, and Health Communication. In addition to all of these accomplishments, Shawn has put up with me over the last several years as my mentor. I can say with certainty that my journey through graduate school and resulting career would not be the same without his guidance and sound advice. He has cheered me on while climbing both literal and metaphorical rock walls. Shawn, thank you from the bottom of my heart for everything you have done and continue to do. So without further ado, Dr. Shawn Marsh.
Tori, thank you so much. I miss you. I am so fantastically proud of you in general, and this is particularly cool for me. As you know, you're sitting in a place that an area of the country I've done some work in, and I just couldn't be prouder of you to be with the New York State Youth Justice Institute. They've got a good one. And thank you, everybody there, Giza, Brian, Alicia, Avery, for putting this on. You're a fantastic team. And welcome, everybody. I'm just delighted to be here and talk to you a bit about some thinking I've been doing around where we're at with this trauma responsive justice stuff, and maybe go out and push the limits a little bit and talk about what I think might be coming down the line. So as I well, right out of the gate, there we go. As I finish my setup here, if you would just for us type in your occupation in the chat box, or kind of your orientation, that'll help Alicia and others kind of screen later questions and target us a little bit as we go through things. I have a sense of who I'm talking to, thanks to Brian, has sent me some of this, but if you would just go ahead and take a moment to enter that, it would help us out a great deal. Tori covered my background pretty quick, and we have a lot of material to get over today, so I am going to jump right in and not talk a whole lot about myself. And then we'll move into some paneled questions and Q&A and all that good stuff. So right off the bat, I want to present the assumptions I'm entering into this. We've been talking about trauma-informed justice and trauma-responsive work for quite a while now, and these are the things that I'm hoping everybody on the call is kind of up to speed on already. But at this beginning is this idea that flight, freeze, and flock behaviors are pretty normal and understandable responses to what we call existential danger. You can call that life and death situations if you want. That's what it's referring to. So fairly serious sort of things that happen in people's lives. Those 4 F's, as we call them, are problematic when they become the automatic response, when one perceives a threat, yet there is no real threat there. That's the disconnect that we see in behaviors that oftentimes cause us some issues and concerns, particularly in the court and justice systems. I'm also assuming that you understand that what gets fired gets wired. Very popular saying, in that what your brain experiences and those things that are shaped as we grow and we develop, as they're repeated, that shapes our behavior and it shapes how our brain is wired. So it's always important to remember that developmentally those experiences matter. And then this is, kind of one of those no-duh ones, but I think it deserves just reinforcing. It's this idea that life is tough. And man, if we don't get that right now, about 2 years into a pandemic, we're missing something. But remember, it's even tougher for some folks than others, even without trauma. And that's just to point out this life isn't a level playing field. And we have to remember that everybody's coming to this work that we're doing, and they're coming for help to us with different background life experiences and lived experiences, and it's not always equal. So this session is one that I've talked about, and it's really kind of the past, present, and future of trauma and trauma-informed work. But I'm going to really focus on the present and the future and what I think might be coming down. But as a quick orientation and context to the history of stress and traumatic stress and the thinking and research in this area, hey, this has been around a long time. This is not a new concept. There's writing on this way back to 800 BC. Homer even talks about characteristics of what we would call now post-traumatic stress. So it's got a lengthy history. We've not always understood it as we do today, but that's why I take the time to do this, is that we need to celebrate a bit of the progress we've made. So very quickly, in the 1700s, they would refer to this as nostalgia. A little later in Civil War, they started thinking, well, there's something going on here, and they would call it soldier's heart. There was some association and understanding that people that had been in train wrecks or train accidents had some of these features, and it was called railway spine. So there's these labels that are coming out for what we talk about today as post-traumatic stress. Most people pick this up around shell shock. World War I are familiar with that, and then of course into World War II, this idea of battle fatigue. The DSM finally picked this up just in the mid 1900s. In 1950, it was actually showed up as a gross stress reaction. Changed a bit over the years, moving into 68. So we're in the midst of Vietnam at this point. And it's a change to adjustment reaction to adult life. What's interesting about that, and we don't have time to go into it, but the diagnostic criteria for that were very limited to prisoners facing the death penalty. It was limited to pregnant women considering suicide. It was limited to military combat veterans. So it wasn't still, even in 68, generally understood or seen as a broad issue within our society. By the third round of DSM, Vietnam had wrapped up, and we had a lot of these vets coming back, and we were really neck deep in our research at this point. We're starting to figure out there's something going on here, and we see revisions all the way up through today. Shout out to the source on this. Dr. Friedman does a fantastic job if you're interested in about the history of stress and where we're at. So this is the landing at the starting point. We've gone from Homer talking about it in very vague terms to nostalgia to now it's a psychiatric, it's in the DSM, and we understand quite a bit about it. So that's where we are today, right? The here and now, so to speak. We made immense amounts of progress. What I forgot to mention is in Civil War, the thinking in the medical field about trauma was that it was actually a morality issue. And there was a lot of thinking that, quite frankly and bluntly, and I'm just going to say it because it's in the literature, is that physicians felt it was largely related to excessive masturbation. So I put that out there to say we've come a fair distance in terms of progress since that time. So we don't view it as a moral failing, a characterological flaw. We understand the process and the functions. It's in a new category altogether now. It's been moved out of the anxiety disorders because we recognize it can also be associated with other mood states like depression and anger. I would say that anger, we see a lot in the justice system, and that'll kind of evolve as we talk more today. The other thing about progress that I want to highlight and celebrate is that we have a much more mindful narrative around this use of the term disorder. There's a lot of victims groups, a lot of victim researchers, a lot of advocates that take offense to, and rightfully so, of why are we tagging a disorder at the end of a victimization experience? And we know that trauma, toxic stress, substantial adversity leads to these sort of reactions and states, but they're typically not things people are asking for to happen to them, right? So I think that we're having this discussion to be careful not to pathologize victims. A lot of folks are writing now and dropping the disorder component completely. Just a quick note there that I think that's progress. I think that's fantastic. We're having these conversations. We have a lot more public awareness, much less stigma. PTSD, right, wrong, or otherwise, is in common parlance in our country now and across the world. It's not always used correctly, but people are aware there's something going on with these experiences. And here's some examples. Jackie Kennedy Onassis very clearly, and if you know the history there, witnessed the assassination of her husband, had post-traumatic stress disorder. Daryl Hammond is a comic on Saturday Night Live you might be familiar with, but he had a horrific childhood with lots of abuse and substance abuse problems, and he experienced self-harm. Whoopi Goldberg, as a child, witnessed airplane crash and has a lot of kind of traumatic stress reactions around that and triggers in flying. So we're seeing more and more of a recognition this just isn't the combat veterans, and this applies more broadly. Not only is there more awareness of this trauma, but a general better understanding of toxic stress and adversity. And this is the classic ACEs pyramid. And I'm not going to go through this other than to say, if you are not familiar with the ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, and this pyramid, it is worth your time to spend some time learning about it. It has really changed our thinking and understanding of how our day-to-day health and functioning is impacted by these negative experiences, particularly early on in life. So I'm not going to walk through this, but I do want to point out at the very bottom here is that we're starting to add some of these layers to this ACEs pyramid that I think are very valuable and set me up for kind of the rest, some of the future parts of this talk. But this idea of historical trauma, or they sometimes will call it generational embodiment, but that there's these impacts at a societal, cultural, group level, and we're better understanding how that is transmitted from generation to generation. We're going to talk about that in the future piece here. The other layer that's added is social conditions and local context. Some people will write in here race issues, poverty, bias, all those kinds of things. But these are those underlying contexts that shore up or set the stage for those adverse childhood experiences. So abuse, neglect, that kind of thing. Again, if you're not familiar with it, I just mentioned it. I encourage you to learn more about it. So just the refresher is that these experiences, and if you look at toxicity on a spectrum with, ouch, paper cut on one end and severe trauma at the other, there's a good chunk of those experiences on that end of things towards the trauma side that lead to robust fight, flight, freeze, or flock responses when somebody perceives danger. Now, I want to challenge you here a little bit, excuse me, to ponder this. Could those responses, fight, flight, freeze, or flock, actually manifest collectively at family and systems level? I will put forth to you that I think it can. I think that if we look at this from a social psychological point of view, if you have a traumatized family unit, that family is likely to engage in similar survival behaviors. And I would venture to guess, if you work with families and you work in the system, you have probably seen this. You have seen families that as a whole will engage in running away. Families that will fight you at every turn. We have families that just are stuck, can't move, deer in the headlights, et cetera, et cetera. I would challenge you to think in the same ways through the systems lens. Have you experienced a system you work with that freezes up when it's threatened, when it's in crisis, or that maybe gets very defensive and fight oriented in terms of defending when they're threatened? It's an interesting thing to think about. And I think that, again, from a sociological perspective, we can make some strong arguments that this plays out more broadly than the individual. Now, I haven't done clinical work in a very, very, very long time. I focus much more on the social psychology of this, but I mentioned kind of where we're at in terms of treatment, and the clinicians on this call, or those folks familiar with the therapeutic approaches, will recognize this kind of the basic, developing rapport, the basic trust that you have with the therapist, learning new coping skills, self-soothing skills, revisiting the event, understanding your triggers, practicing of skills, all within the safe therapeutic relationship, eventually moving the narrative from I'm not surviving, I've thrived, I've lived, there's good things that can come out of this. And we're going to end on that positive psychology note today, by the way. And then lastly, connect and provide pro-social relationships. So that probably sounds familiar. And then at a systems level or institutional level, or community level, these are kind of the frameworks that I think through and others think through. And there's parallels here. We don't have time to dissect that down further, but really what we're looking for is to introduce into our institutions a sense of safety. We want to give people the ability to have agency, to make some decisions about their own life and about their own course in life. And then we want to make sure there's adequate support, positive pro-social support across persons, practice, policy, and environment. Now, persons is that warm touch, the day-to-day interactions, they are healing. We're going to talk about that. Practice and policy hold hands. We can talk about that if we have time. And then last but not least, environment. We're definitely going to talk about that because I think it's an often missed low-hanging fruit for a lot of systems and courts. So ultimately, all of these universal precautions that we're going to hint at and talk about is a win-win. And it's a win-win not just for those folks that have these histories, but it's a win-win for the people that are administrating or administrators of health, of justice, that are running these institutions. You're going to find when these sort of approaches are adopted that things get a whole lot easier in terms of how your systems function and the level of conflict and drama oftentimes that you have. We're going to talk about that in concrete ways. But for now, I'm just kind of curious about your assessment of just how hot a topic this is in our world, in academia and the literature. But if you had to take a guess about how many peer-reviewed scholarly articles have been published in the last year or so. And the poll's running. We've got estimates. A lot of people are coming in at about 3,500. Seeing a lot of people up in the 25,000, 13. A few people say a few. I'm going to bet the people at the low end are in academia and know the perils of publishing and the difficulties. They're reflecting their experiences. It's hard to get stuff published, right? Okay. Very good. So I would say that looks pretty clearly. About 28% is the winner there with 3,500. Alicia, I'm going to go ahead and there you go. Thank you. Share the results and then stop sharing when you're ready. And then the answer is about slightly over 13,000 peer-reviewed scholarly publications in the last 12 months alone. So how did I come to this? We use something here at the university called OneSearch. It's just a very, very large creeper crawler AI that goes through a whole lot of databases. I entered that search term in quotes up front there, and it kicked back 13,000. I eliminated all the books. I eliminated all the gray literature stuff that's not peer reviewed necessarily. That is an immense amount of scholarship. And you look at where it's coming out is fantastic. We're seeing people in courts, medicine, schools, juvenile justice, social work, medicine, dentistry. It's coming out all over the place. And I think this is a fantastic sign that people are picking this up, and rightfully so. So we know some other things too. And one of them is, and this just right out of the gate, this isn't Shawn, the world according to Shawn and Tori and Brian and Giza and others, that this is based on science. This is a robust line of literature and research. We have a pretty good handle on a lot of the basics of this stuff. So this just isn't a warm, fuzzy feeling thing. This is evidence-based and driven in that direction. We also know that victims can be offenders and offenders can be victims. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. But we talk about in public health that switches the dialogue from bad and good, if and then, you and them, in and out, all those kinds of dichotomous models. If we switch to this injury model, much more helpful. Everybody understands what it is to be hurt, right? And this trauma and this focus on adversity, it really is kind of a universal point of rallying. Everybody knows what this hurt feels like, right? So if we can develop that empathy and keep that versus you're a bad person, you don't deserve our empathy or sympathy, we're going to be a lot more productive. We know that trauma-informed care in these movements saves money. It's more humane. We have some evidence that, Brian, your hand is up. I'm sorry. Oops, it went down. Data that we save money, it's more humane. We see that reductions in sick leave helps with secondary stress. So there's some value, there's some benefit to this in terms of the investment. We know some other things through the work out there in the social laboratories, and a lot of the folks on this call, I have no doubt, are involved in some of these. The National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges has a really cool project going on around trauma. And it's called Linking Systems of Care. And it's really about connecting these communities of healing. So it's a live social lab, a learning environment, a learning culture, sharing of information, and they're exploring these things as a group across several states. If you're familiar with the council's model court projects, it's some similar sort of feel to it as that there's a centralized bringing together of the community to look at and improve systems operations in child welfare and juvenile justice. What I think is cool is if you really stop and look, and I don't know if you've experienced this, but this is everywhere around us. And if you really know what you're looking for, you see it blossoming. And I'll tell you a very, very quick story that just made my day, and I will use it for an example for a long time, was recently getting my teeth cleaned, and I engaged in a wonderfully detailed, nuanced discussion of trauma-informed care with the dental hygienist, who informed me that they are now required to take a full semester of trauma-informed dentistry. And it's purely in response to people that have a lot of anxiety and bad experiences around dentistry. She had some stories I can't go into, we don't have time, but you would be amazed at the existential crisis that people have in a dental chair occasionally. But it does speak to this point that if you look, it's in a lot of different places. So that's kind of where we're at. And now for the fun part, I'm gonna take some liberty here and project or predict, as we say in statistics in our world, but a little bit about the future of where we might be heading. And I want to start right out with the explicit statement that diversity, equity, inclusion is a priority, period. There's just so much going on that we have to take a breath and we have to address this and address it directly. And it really comes down to DEI being a trauma-informed practice. My thinking is if you have a powerful total institution like a court, a hospital, a prison, if they don't look like or otherwise resonate or somehow reflect the community, the community it serves is fundamentally not going to feel safe in the face of that power of that institution. And safety, we know, is a core component of healing. So DEI is trauma responsive practice. We have to have systems, powerful systems that reflect our, for lack of a better term, our consumers and our communities. And being explicit about this and making it a priority, I think, is a critical step. Now, when we think about communities of healing, we take a public health perspective. We know that public health is an issue of justice, that we've seen with the COVID crisis and the pandemic, that there is racial injustice and lack of equity in terms of access to vaccines and health. There's disproportionate outcomes in terms of sickness and death. So finding equity within health as an issue of justice. I'm very explicit that I believe courts are a community of healing. This is from my time working with courts and judges, and the incredible power and ability that a good judicial leadership in a community can have in terms of bringing people together at the same table and making these decisions to better the systems that they're working with. It's really about communication, coordination, collaboration. These are, nothing new here. Relationships do matter. And a lot of this is on the ground, handshaking, making relationships with other systems and other stakeholders in your system, having that connection. This one's a little, might be a little controversial, but I'm going to suggest it because it's kind of a current thinking in terms of crisis, that when we're in a crisis situation or fast moving systems that are dynamic, our goal may not be to optimize functioning. It may be that we need to be focusing on how to adapt the best we can to meet the needs in the moment. This isn't a reflection that we can't achieve and be aspirational. I think we do need to be aspirational. But I think this recognizes that when you're in crisis and that when you're dealing with trauma, you're dealing with a dynamic situation and you got to be quick on your feet. So adapting might be a better orientation. Last thing I want to mention here in terms of communities of healing is a really interesting approach. I'm just starting to learn about this myself. It's coming out of actually the northern regions and countries. Alaska is involved, Norway, Sweden, those kinds of things, but it's called a One Health model. And it's taking a lot of indigenous practices and in this interdisciplinary thinking, holistic approaches to what they are calling global health. And it considers not just humans, but our interaction with the climate, environment, with race, culture, indigenous, native populations, and even animals, and how they all are interdependent, and what that might mean for creating an improved system or a more trauma-informed care. Now, speaking of animals, I would be amiss because this is an area that we're starting to develop a line of research here at the university around comfort dogs, courthouse dogs, emotional support animals, those types of things. So we have three categories there, and a lot of these emotional support dogs, kind of in the middle here, we're seeing more use in courts. And might be to have some time to talk about that a little bit later if it comes up, but this is kind of what it looks like in practice, is that there is some ability to provide support for people going through a stressful questioning, for example, or they have to testify, a child has to testify about their abuse or that sort of thing. But we can talk about why this is I think a promising practice and one that's going to grow. But just to remember to think broadly and bigly about trauma-informed care and what it could mean. I mentioned at the start that environment matters, and this is an actual court. This is one of the judges that we work with that's involved with the National Council. I'm not going to read this, but you can read it on your own. Essentially, you get the sense of a fairly typical courtroom or a courthouse in a lot of ways. Kind of dark, overcrowded, a little bit chaotic, lots of people kind of shouting, those sorts of things. And now, after having engaged in a lot of thinking and working and talking about what this could look like in that jurisdiction, you can see a pretty substantial change in environment. They've put up Dr. Seuss murals, doors are painted. You got to love Dr. Seuss, right? There's a lot of coaching and work around smiling and showing families where to wait and these warm handoffs. Substantially different tones between these two courts, which is the same court. It's just an implementation of a different way of thinking. And I would say, I don't know what it costs to do all this, but I'm going to take a wild guess. It wasn't much. It wasn't much. A low cost sort of adjustment here in terms of environment. And, this is another example of some of the things that you might be thinking about is on your left here. Not a lot of natural light, not a lot of artwork, not a lot of greenery at all. Pretty cold, pretty clinical. And on the right side of things, you'll see much more kind of open and bright, higher ceilings, at least an ability to see outdoors, more comfortable chairs, those kinds of things. We do know from the research that this stuff matters, and it's moving the dial a tad. I'm not going to say it's going to cure everything, but as part of this philosophy is this is going to be a lot of little things initially to kind of move things forward. So, you could be introducing just plants. Greenery, we know, is associated with reduced anxiety. Light music or other sounds other than people humming and yelling and crying, anything that can kind of settle the atmosphere down and the stimulus is important, because we know that folks, particularly folks that are suffering from PTSD, are hypervigilant. So everything we're trying to do is just tone it down. I don't know about you, but I benefit from that, and I don't even have PTSD. I just like nice and calm, right? So that's kind of the direction that we're trying to head. We got to have patience with this. People, I hear it all the time, is like, we've been talking about this for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Come on. Hey, we're dealing with major social ills and social problems here. So there's a lot of different avenues in making change, and some of this is gonna take time. This is part of our life. Prevention is a whole nother issue. It is incredibly important. It's not the topic of this particular talk, but we have to remember that bad things happen. It's part of life, unfortunately. We have to be reminded too that we can have collective trauma. 9/11 was an example of this. COVID is an example of this, where whole societies, if not even the globe, is going through what I definitely could argue is an existential crisis. We have people dying all around us. So it meets these kind of key criteria for the level of severity. These things didn't appear overnight. We didn't just fall into racial inequality in 2019 and 2020. This has been around a long time. We've lost our ways in some people serving institutions. It's focused on what are the needs of the institution versus the needs of the consumer. Historical traumatization, things that have happened to groups of people in the past, it's still playing out now. Healthcare, poverty, these things just didn't appear. And we got to remember that. There's no vaccine for this at this point. We can cross our fingers and hope. This is just going to take time and effort, and we need to keep going. Need to balance these quick solutions with long-term realities. I think we might talk about that here in a bit, but there's some things you can do very, very quickly and low cost, no cost, low cost, no cost, and then more distal things further down the line that hopefully we're thinking about and moving towards. But in my mind's eye, and I'm kind of simple in my head with heuristics, but I think it does help. When I think about how best to do this day to day is if we look at injury occurring through adversity and trauma and toxic stress, if that injury is by 1,000 little nicks of that stress, right? 1,000 different little cuts, that healing is going to need 1,000 Band-Aids. And those Band-Aids are every point of contact a person has with the system. So when they come in and they see Brian at the front door of the court, he is going to be smiling like he is now. He's going to be a warm, good guy like he is. He is going to have empathy, and he's going to work with that person, and he's put on a Band-Aid as he hands them off to the next person. And Alicia picks it up from there and does the same thing. So you get my point, is that there's a cumulative healing here when whole systems adopt this frame of reference. Connectedness is incredibly important. We are social animals. We have to have the human contact, human connection, and human support. Classic lines of literature identify up to and around 1/3 of behavior change can be attributed to the relationship with a person in somebody's life, typically the therapist or the pro-social person doing the coaching. That's not insignificant. That's a lot. Relationships matter. We have to remember, and this isn't always popular, but I'm going to say it, is that our job is customer service. When we work in the field of helping humans, that is our job. And you can twist it and play it different ways and say, no, it's not. Yes, it is. It is what we signed up for, and we should be absolutely feel privileged to have the opportunity to help others. We are in a position that we can do good things. And we have to remember that, and we have to remember that it's our job. Again, social allergies won't kill you. What I mean by social allergies, we all run into people that just rub us the wrong way. You've all had the experience where you meet somebody and within 10 seconds, you both know we're never going to be friends. There's just too much of a disconnect. It's not going to kill you. It's not going to kill you to work with people that rub you the wrong way. Now, letting it get under your skin and weigh on you over the long term, that secondary stress might kill you. But I think just being aware of, there's people that are going to annoy you, and that's all right. It's okay. There's ways to deal with that. Again, warm touch, warm handoffs. We need to get back to people helping people. There's no way around it. We just have to understand that. And I really think moving forward, we're going to see a lot of retooling and specialized or micro-credentialing around consumer advocacy, health system navigators, liaisons, people that specialize in connecting people, these systems together, of walking people through communities of healing. I think it's a specialty. I think it's a career. We all know, and I am sure we have lots, everybody on this call is this way. It is absolutely gold. And we have to recognize that and retool our thinking as a country and our world about pay and skill and what do we want in life? What do we want out of these folks and what are they doing? We need the help. Let's professionalize this. Let's pay people. Let's get them. Let's find the people that do this well and make it worth their while. And ultimately, it comes down to vision, knowing where we're going, that this is going to take time, but we're in it together. It's going to take that empathy building, and transparency. If we don't do this with open conversations, and I've said some things here today that in the past have got me in trouble, I'm not going to change it because I want to be transparent. And I think that we have to have these conversations about what this means and how it looks, particularly for the consumers, for the public. If we look like we're hiding something, that safety component, which is critical to being trauma responsive, is gone. Okay. I'm almost done here, and we're going to move into the questions. This is to introduce some of the technology about, okay, well, Sean, that's great, that's fine. Magic money somewhere, and we'll recruit all these people, and they're going to be paid well, and they're going to be wonderful liaisons and system navigators, but how in the world are the rest of us going to have any time? Here are some suggestions. Some of this is based on what's coming out, but also some thinking around technology that's happening. We're seeing a movement towards co-locating courts with clinics, courts with education offices, those kinds of things. So there's this kind of a one-stop shop movement that we're seeing more of. We're seeing an increase in resource sharing and efficiencies. I think COVID has forced us to address information sharing. What can we share without getting in trouble? I think that those have been smoothed a little bit out of necessity. We're all working remote, or we did for a long time. How do we get this information back and forth? How do we make this less of a lift for all? I'm fascinated by the technology that's emerging. I feel like sometimes I fell asleep in 1995 and I woke up in 2020 and I was like, where did that come from? But we've got all this stuff rolling out with artificial intelligence, machine learning. Quantum computing will blow your mind in terms of what's coming down the road in that area. Robotics. We're looking here at UNR to actually purchase a robotic comfort animal and do some research around that. This technology is just blowing up. And what technology does for us is improve efficiency and improves data processing, obviously. I want to mention real quick that technology is neutral, right? And we see a lot of concern around artificial intelligence and deep fakes and these kinds of things. And we do need to be concerned. But remember, that's the application. In of itself, artificial intelligence is value neutral. It's what we do with it. But these sort of things are going to allow us to have much faster communication, transfer of data, access to data, so we know who we're working with. There's not going to be as much of this, I don't know where the file is, or I don't know how to get that information. It's going to be much more centralized, I think. All that sort of stuff. The back to the artificial intelligence, machine learning, that's going through and identifying patterns and data very, very, very quickly, so we can make real-time adjustments. And this is my last point here. It improves rapid cycle testing. So when we talk about make decisions that are data-driven, we're moving to a time where data-driven decisions are going to be essentially real-time because of the speed of the computing processes and whatnot. The last thing I'll mention, obviously virtual, we know that, we're coming on 2 years of experience there, but I think improved transportation is one we don't think about in terms of access to justice. We all have experiences where we've had clients or stories we've heard where people just can't even get to court when they're supposed to because of transportation problems. Currently, right now in Reno, we have a transportation strike. Our bus system is down. This is causing problems. I think driverless transportation is going to be part of that solution. We also have going here soon going to be launched a completely driverless bus system around the university in the lower parts of Reno. So this stuff is coming, and it's coming very, very quickly. And I think that we need to be mindful and be ready to leverage it. Lots of other stuff with technology, kind of running short on time, so I'm going to speed it up a little bit here. But epigenetic research, that goes back to the historical trauma that we talked about. It's really this toxicity and stress on gene expression. It's not about changing your DNA. It's about what gets expressed or not expressed. It's been around a lot longer than people think. We're in a couple, I think about 4 decades now into epigenetic research. I think it is going to be a game changer. If we can figure out how toxic stress turns on certain expressions of genes, then we're very close to learning how to turn them off again. Neuroscience, amazing work in terms of imaging and understanding how the brain works. We just witnessed real time, literally a vaccine moonshot. We went from no vaccine to, in very short order, what would have previously taken years and years and years. Medication and treatment. Virtual reality is being explored quite a bit in terms of a potential intervention with trauma. MDMA, ecstasy, these kinds of things. It sounds weird, but we're seeing a lot of research that suggests that there's something that is very beneficial in certain circumstances. So I think we're going to see that targeted stimulation and whatnot. Last but not least, it just amazes me. We are literally flying helicopters around another planet. And when you kind of stop and think about that, it makes you really kind of motivated to go, God, if we could do that, can't we just do something here to make things just a little bit better, just a little easier for folks and leverage technology. As we move into the post-pandemic, and these aren't meant to be answered necessarily, but just be thinking about, what do you want your work to look like? Does it need to be the same? Is it going to be different? What are the consumers and administrators of justice facing? How can we be ready? We know a lot of it's coming back to real in-person court hearings and whatnot, and being prepared for that if you're not already going back to it. But even beyond that, there's some planning that we need to have in place. What I want to end on here, though, is that this is an opportunity to really pivot towards a strengths-based positive psychology orientation. We are wired evolutionary, and it has everything to do with flight, freeze, and flock, our primitive brain, our amygdala. We are wired to see negative. We're wired to see threat. That's what we are. And we can override that, and we don't have to embrace that as our guiding model. We don't have to have deficit models in our work or a risk elimination. We can have protective factor enhancement. We can have that humanistic touch. We can look for strengths in life and play on those. And resiliency theory is a fantastic way to look at that and how to approach that. But that is for an entirely different talk. Whoops. Well, so as I kind of move to Brian, and Brian might have some questions for me, just take the time to listen as I answer. And if you'd like, ask some questions. If you have some questions, go ahead and put them in the chat box. And if you have any thoughts about where you think we're going to be in 20, 30 years, I'd love to hear them. You guys are out in the field doing this every day, and I talk about this quite a bit. So I would appreciate just hearing what you think is coming down the line from the day-to-day folks doing this work. And while you're doing that, just very quickly, if I can do a blatant plug and pitch before I turn it over to Brian, but I have a doctoral student who is desperate for a couple parents to interview. She is interested in talking with parents that have a child in detention. Her dissertation is about that experience. She has almost all the interviews done. She just needs a few more. If you would be willing, or folks that might be able to connect her with a parent, or you might know a parent yourself, please take a look at this link. All the information is there. And you can send parents directly there as well if you prefer to do that. But this will be on the slides for the handout as well. But if you have any ideas, I really appreciate it. So with that, I'm going to leave this screen up here for a second. And then Brian, as you get warmed up and ready to go, I guess we just kind of stop sharing, and it's you and I, right? Got it.
Thank you so
Please
much.
get in touch with me. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Sean, and thank you to all of those of you who have submitted some Q&A questions for Dr. Marsh. We will be getting to those shortly. If you do have a question and you've not yet submitted it, I highly encourage you to submit that in the Q&A box. But one question that I have, Sean, is in recent years, trauma-informed has been a frequent term that emerges when addressing best practices. But there's no set standard as to what trauma-informed practices entail. So in the context of this discussion, what do you think are some of the key principles or practices necessary for trauma-informed care with a focus on justice-involved youth?
Right. Yeah, so definitional issues are always kind of the plague of any movement or change in practice or attempts to reform systems. And trauma-informed can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But I think it's more of a mindset at the end of the day. I think that people are starting to appreciate that it has a lot to do with being empathetic. It's about understanding what other people are going through and being a little softer, kinder, and gentler. So there's that kind of macro mindset component to my answer. But then I also return to the very, very basic heuristic of encouraging safety, of ensuring safety, not encourage, ensure safety, promote self-determination, and then do what you can to connect with social support networks. And again, that's across person, policy, practice, and environment. But that model is about as reduction as I can get and cover all the major things. But it's helpful because it's easy to remember, and it covers the major components of the direction that we want to move. Again, safety, agency, and support.
Great, thank you. So back in August, Dr. Keith Cruz presented on justice-involved adolescents and trauma-responsive practices. We asked him this question, but I'd like to get your take on it as well. What do you think is the biggest obstacle in better incorporating trauma-responsive practices and policies?
Well, so understanding, and that's what we've been tackling, doing webinars like this and a lot of education over the last decade, 2 decades, even more. And I think the biggest challenge really comes down to political will and resource. People get this, and once they understand it, they see it's not an excuse. It's not this, kind of wimpy, soft, ultra liberal sort of, oh, everybody's fuzzy wuzzy and let's treat them with kid gloves. They understand, no, that this is really in our best interest. People get that, but having leaders and communities that will rally around that and give you that political will to make sometimes these really small common sense changes, and then resourcing it. But that scares people to death when you say that, well, we need resources. Of course, everybody needs resources. But I think there's some retooling, and the retooling that we can do at low cost, no cost is going to free up a lot of resources. But my short answer to that is still political will.
Thank you. And with that, I think we're going to move into our audience Q&A portion.
Sure.
So the first question, the attendee said that they'd like to institute trauma-informed care for the systems that they work within. Can you recommend any resources to start off with?
Yeah, so my go-to for any of this stuff is the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. There are National Centers for Child Traumatic Stress. They kind of have 2 acronyms, but they're funded by SAMHSA. They're the go-to really in the US. They're located out of UCLA and Duke, and they have practice sites all over the country. But this is what they do, is they develop trauma-informed resources for all kinds of different contexts and all kinds of different crises, all kinds of different systems. They have everything from courts to military to major disasters, everything from more clinical sort of orientations on what to do, all the way up to systems level. So you can easily find them with a quick Google search. Again, it's National Child Traumatic Stress Network, and again, located out of UCLA and Duke. But they are all online. It's almost all free. In fact, I think it is all free. You may have to register for some access, depending if it's for clinicians or not, but much of it's public, and it's fantastic resource. It is my go-to.
As we talk about the impact of trauma on our society, this attendee is not hearing a lot of talk about the normalizing of trauma. We've all been traumatized by COVID and its racial impacts, yet the impact of this trauma is ignored. How do we address our systems and institutions who are responding to traumatic behavior and creating more harm and trauma. They're particularly talking about the increase in school suspension and youth incarceration. So for context, their local schools are hiring more SROs to address student behavior, and they know that the data supports this only increases arrests and punitive discipline in school and trauma.
Yeah. So there's a lot to unpack there. So So when we have a group level or a collective level trauma like this, we do risk becoming numb. And I do think that a lot of us, the general population, is numb, and we're not really thinking through that lens of trauma. I think we should be, and I think that you're seeing it play out in our responses within schools. And I'm glad you brought that up. And we've seen in the news very recently some just really nasty, horrible practices in schools around poor student behavior with very young children. So there's a messaging that's either not getting out, or it's being overridden by administrators' own level of trauma, stress, and disconnect during these times. I think that, as with most things, continuing to have the conversation and having it explicitly, having our voice heard, putting it out there, but then also just reminding ourselves constantly, and I have to do this, that this isn't normal. This is really tough. This has challenged even the most resilient people on this planet, and will continue to do so. And when we can accept that, or not accept it, but when we're open and explicit about that, I think the door to that empathy and change in practice. The last thing I will say, and I will get in trouble for this, I'm not a big fan of SROs. I've been on the record for that for a long time. I think that there are better ways to handle disciplinary problems than having police within schools. I know there's safety and security issues that people are concerned about, but I think we do have really good models and examples in parts of this country of good trauma-informed schools, and they don't use school resource officers. Sorry, if I have any school resource officers, I apologize.
So I'm going to take a step back for a moment.
Sure.
Back to the obstacles question.
Sure.
So you mentioned political will. So related to that point, how do you think the fear of demographic decline, particularly among white folks, and with that the risk for radicalization of far-right movements, how do these impact our ability to make the pivots you talked about?
Yeah, so this is where I need to put on my political science and sociology hat. That is a fantastic question, and I wish we had a lot of time to dig into it, because that's a really, really complex question. I am concerned. I am concerned that the radicalization and the polarization in this country is going to set us back. I think that just even the politicization and what we went through on January 6th and over the last year, we could argue was another collective trauma. I know people that are scared to death right now of what's happening in the country, and I'm on whether they're white, they're black, or whatever. This is just a really, really challenging time. I'm not sure I have a good answer on what we can do right now in terms of a concrete sort of intervention there. But I do think being open and honest that this is very disconcerting, and it is impacting how certain systems function. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to look in different parts of the country are fundamentally diametrically opposed to practice in other parts of the country. And we're seeing it on voting rules. We're seeing it on abortion rights. I mean, and I'm trying to stay apolitical here, but there are tensions and substantial tensions that are contributing to this kind of ongoing rolling COVID trauma adversity we need to be very mindful of. So if nothing else, even though I didn't answer your question, I would say thank you for asking the question, because it is something we need to be explicit in recognizing. It's going on, and we need to be careful.
So I think this is the last question that we'll probably get to today. The attendee asked what impact you think climate change might have on these things in the next 25 years.
Yeah, when I think of climate change in this context, I go right back to that first fundamental component of responding to trauma, and that's safety. What I hear from young people today is they don't feel safe. And as a collective level, is that they're disappointed. They're mad at the older generations. They're mad at decision makers and politicians. that were, folks aren't responding aggressively and quick enough to address climate change, and they're scared, and they don't know what the future is going to hold. Quite frankly, I don't blame them. I was in, Reno all summer, and we were on fire all summer. And it's just kind of a no duh to see that it is climate change related, and we have a lot of stuff going on. But I think that's my major concern, is that we have to have some way to address it, because that is such a universal global safety concern. You want to talk about collective trauma, that has it written all over it.
Thank you. So Sean, I'd like to thank you on behalf of the YJI and everyone in attendance today for taking the time to share this really, really great information with us. But before I get to the closing announcements, do you have any last thoughts for us?
So I just wanted to thank again the team there at the New York State Youth Justice Institute. You guys again are fantastic, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today, and the folks that have joined us. Thank you for doing that. I'm just impressed with the amount of interest. We ran a little bit long, and we didn't get quite all the questions. That was my bad. But I hope the material I covered, if nothing else, it's really designed to get you thinking. It's not necessarily designed to answer all your questions. I know people are burning for the concrete answer on how to do this in real ways, and that's hard to do in a 50-minute session, obviously. But if you're interested in learning more about this, do contact me. Contact Tori and Brian. Just use the network and reach out. Again, I think we all embrace this idea. This is what we do and why we're here. So we're pretty generous with our time and our thinking. And I would always love to hear from folks if they have questions. We're here to help. And I appreciate, again, your time today and allowing me to kind of give you what I'm thinking. So I appreciate it.
Thanks, Sean. Before we close, I do have just a few announcements and items to put on everyone's radar. The next session of the Lunch and Learn series will be on November 9th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. We will be hosting Dr. Robert Emmons, Professor of Psychology at the University of California, Davis, and he will be discussing the concept of gratitude and how it relates to various indicators of well-being. So be on the lookout for registration information from us for this webinar session. Within the next day or two, we will be sending a survey to you all via email. If you have the time, please complete the survey, as it allows you to provide further feedback and questions for us. This information will be used to improve future webinar sessions as well. The survey should take no longer than about 5 minutes, and we will also be putting the link for this survey in the chat. Finally, if you've not already done so, feel free to connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. The links to those accounts can be found on our website. And just a reminder that the views expressed here are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views of the New York State Youth Justice Institute. And in closing, I just want to thank you all for taking part in this session of the YJI Lunch and Learn series. We hope that you've gained something from this webinar and that you continue to think about the work that Dr. Marsh has presented today. And we also look forward to seeing you at future YJI webinars and events. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great rest of your week.